So at this moment, the live streaming in the Netherlands for all the other PT programs starts, because we like to share, of course, our very inspiring keynote of Dave Nicholls. And as Arwin already mentioned, we are organizing this program together with all the other Dutch PT programs, so we're going to share it in that way as well. So Dave, I already talked to you yesterday. We already had an inspiring session with you, with our curriculum committee. Patricia, you already mentioned the challenges we have to face. So yeah, I think it's good to share it here and work it on together with you. But David, we're very pleased to have you here. You're working as an associate professor in New Zealand, so it's not just an hour flying coming here. You're a physiotherapist, lecturer, researcher, writer of a book. Well, I think many of you, or hopefully everyone, has read it. And you're focusing on, well, a critical way of thinking how is the future has to be for physiotherapy. So please come forward. We're very honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. As these blinds were coming down, I felt like I was in a Bond movie. Like you're all locked in now, there's no escape. Yes, well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the opportunity to spend some time with you in the Netherlands this week and to present to you today. My name is Dave Nicholls, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Clinical Sciences at AUT in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm the founder and co-chair of the International Critical Physiotherapy Network and also founding chair of the International Physio History Association. I'm also the author of the book titled The End of Physiotherapy, and I'm deeply honoured that you chose to use the title of the book as the theme for this conference. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Henk Willemsen and Karen Solman for the invitation to present today, Arwin Nimmes, Dean of the School, members of the School of Health Studies, and Patricia Almeida, and all the members of the European Network. To colleagues from around Europe, and especially the students who are here today, many congratulations on your incredible work and on organising this magnificent European Network conference. I should say that normally my preference is not to work off a script, but I want to be very careful about what I'm saying today. And so I apologise if I spend some time reading, but part of the reason for that is because I also wanted to make available a transcript of the talk today so you can see it in its raw state. So normally I'd make much more contact with you during a talk, but for the purposes of this I want to be quite specific in the language I'm using. So I apologise if it feels a little bit removed. I want to tackle two main questions in my talk today. How did physiotherapy arrive at this point in its history? And what will we need to do to keep the profession healthy into the future? All professions exist for a reason. Journalists report the news, plumbers repair the drains, musicians entertain us. All professions, including physical therapy, physiotherapy, exist to help out in society. So our existence depends on us addressing important societal issues. We are where we are today, perhaps the third largest health profession with nearly 500,000 members worldwide, because we've done the job of helping out very well in the past. Because we've answered society's call, we've had laws written to protect us, funds given to us to subsidise our training and pay our salaries, and access to the entire public health system, opportunities that many other professions can only dream of. So it would not be unreasonable to argue that all we have to do is keep doing what's brought us success before, and if all things stay the same, then physiotherapy will continue to grow in size, respectability and influence. But the key phrase here is, if all things stay the same, because we all know everything is changing. You don't have to look far to realise that the world we live in today is very different from the one that physiotherapy first emerged into more than a century ago. Physiotherapy faces some unique challenges in adapting to the 21st century, not least its long-standing affinity with the idea of the body as machine. This, as much as anything, may be contributing to a growing sense within the profession that we need to adapt and change, but we don't know how. I've been interested in this question for many years, and some of this work culminated in the book, The End of Physiotherapy, which asked, how can this be? How have we arrived at this situation, and what can we do about it? The book traces some of the history of physiotherapy, but most especially focuses on the decisions and discourses that have shaped the profession today. The book concludes with the belief that the same conditions that fed physiotherapy throughout the 20th century may now be poisoning us. And that is the very way physiotherapists think and practice that may now bring about our demise. But to understand why I'm saying this and what it may mean for the future of the profession, we need to backtrack a little. So let's begin with this. If all professions exist and prosper because they provide solutions to society's problems, then one of the things we should ask when we analyse physiotherapy is, what are the questions that physiotherapy is the answer for? Tracing the history of the profession, it's relatively easy to see why physiotherapy was successful. When Victorians were outraged by the massage scandals of 1894, it was the women of the Society of Trained Masseuses that proved you could touch people without scandal. When World War I broke out, it was these same women that showed that they would do anything, no matter how brutal, to return injured men to the front line and the factory. And when infantile paralysis struck in the interwar years, physical therapy numbers mushroomed as hundreds of new recruits flocked to become therapists. Not surprisingly, when governments moved to formalise healthcare in the middle of the 20th century, physiotherapists were in the prime position to become the sole orthodox providers of physical rehabilitation services. So you can perhaps see that the kinds of questions we were asked by society were, can you get this person back to work quickly? Can you rehabilitate this patient after surgery? Can you help this child walk normally? Can you help this elderly patient to regain his or her independence? And one of the most important allies we had in answering these questions was biomedicine. And so our approach came to be about fixing acute illnesses and injuries, assessing bones and muscles, mobilising soft tissues and manipulating joints, helping people move better and reducing pain. And with this, our influence spread across the entire field of medicine, from cardiorespiratory to musculoskeletal, women's health to paediatrics. But it's impossible to imagine that with so much change taking place in the world, that these questions, never mind these answers, would stay the same. And sooner or later, new questions would be asked. Sarah Nettleton, one of the most prominent medical sociologists today, has shown, for example, that whereas traditional healthcare was very much about treating disease and acute illness, about passive patients and hospital-based specialists, healthcare today is increasingly about people as the experts of their own illness, about complexity and living with problems that cannot be cured. So the old types of questions on the left are rapidly being replaced by a whole new set of questions, and some of these we have no answer for. But to understand how we might find some answers, we should first understand something about how the problems arose in the first place. For much of physiotherapy's history, the profession has had two main masters, and I use the word masters here quite advisedly: the state and the medical profession. From the state, we gained our social capital, our privileged status as the most trusted provider of physical rehabilitation. For much of the 20th century, we've been part of what is called the grand bargain between the nation-state and its preferred professions. In this bargain, we promised to return people to work, make them independent and function normally, in return for legislative protection, funding, access to the healthcare system, and social status as a trusted profession. And from the medical profession, we gained a patron. Doctors provided high-quality referrals, father-like encouragement and support, a philosophy of practice, a vocabulary to understand health and illness, and a healthcare system built in its own image that we fitted like a hand in a velvet glove. And this grand bargain endured for much of the 20th century. So what changed? Well, many things. There were wars, technological inventions, and some massive social revolutions. But two events in particular I think are particularly significant for healthcare. The first was the civil rights movement and the social upheavals of the 1960s. The second was the 1973-74 oil crisis and the rise of neoliberal economics. These are far too complex to do justice to here, but in the broadest terms, the 60s civil rights movement saw massive revolt against traditional authority figures, people who had led the world to the brink of destruction. The orthodox medical profession was a particular target, with feminists and disability rights activists especially arguing that healthcare had been dominated by elite white men who had begun to practice in quite arrogant and ethically abusive ways, all under the guise of scientific objectivity and detachment. Many of the marginalised voices who had suffered under this treatment began to speak out, and they haven't stopped since. And the second was the rise of neoliberalism and the end of the welfare state, which can be traced quite specifically to the oil crisis of 1973-74, which caused many Western countries to collapse into recession and forced a complete redesign of the economic landscape in Europe and North America. The answer to the recession came from politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who instigated a massive programme of reforms that included tax cuts, reduced public funding for education, healthcare, pensions and benefits, and opening up of the public sector to market competition. This is now what we know as neoliberalism. And the effect over the last half century has been dramatic. But what does it mean for physiotherapy? It means that our two most important social anchors no longer protect physiotherapy in the way they once did. It means that our philosophy of practice no longer carries the same social capital. And it means that the state no longer sees itself as the sponsor and protector of professions like physiotherapy, and that professions like ours need to find a new grand bargain. But it also means physiotherapists are now truly free to shape their profession's destiny without the ties that once helped us grow, but now feel more like restraints. We are now free to decide what physiotherapy in the 21st century might mean, and which questions it might now be the answer for. But before we can do this, we have to deal with a major problem that I've called the physiotherapy paradox. The basic idea here is that because physiotherapists answered society's problems by adopting a biomechanical approach to the body, focusing on short-term fixes, curative treatments, and only on the body of the person in front of us, we effectively ignored all of the other ways that people come to understand health and illness. This didn't matter in the past, when medicine was all-powerful and we had no competition. But now healthcare is infinitely more complex, and we don't have the vocabulary to know how to respond. I suppose we never thought that we'd need to learn about the cultural, economic, philosophical and social dimensions of health and illness. We thought knowing the origins and insertions of gracilis and being able to diagnose shoulder impingement would be enough. But now we find that we don't have the tools to diagnose what's happening beyond the body in front of us, and we don't have the understanding to design our way out. So the physiotherapy paradox is that the very thing that gave physiotherapy so much power and prestige in the 20th century, treating the body as machine, now risks bringing about our demise. Consider these examples, for instance. This is a very busy graphic. But deliberately so, because what this graphic attempts to show is just a few of the contemporary challenges now facing health, education and the professions. I've divided them up into specific social and technological challenges to make them easier to distinguish. Note that any one of these challenges could be the subject of an entire book, and indeed many have. All of them are pertinent to physiotherapy, and each one is a complex blend of social philosophy, political economy, cultural values and beliefs. And yet the entire volume of writing and thought on these issues that currently exists in the physiotherapy literature amounts to nothing by comparison with how much energy is going into studying things like upper limb function after stroke or the benefits of pre-op physiotherapy. These clinical trials are important, but they cannot help us define a new direction for physiotherapy in the 21st century. We are most definitely not going to find answers to these things in the latest book on musculoskeletal rehab or new guidelines on the treatment of spondyloarthritis. But I would go further even than that. Whilst we may sometimes experience the direct surface effects of major changes in healthcare, it is the cultural, economic, political and social driving forces that are often hidden from plain sight that have the most profound effect on us, and it's these we really need to understand. Greater use of evidence-based practice and the results of more clinical trials won't help us here. If we are going to make sense of the world of healthcare today, we are going to need tools drawn from philosophy, the humanities and social sciences that have been developed over the last 100 years, tools that most physiotherapists are almost entirely unaware of. We need these tools because the challenges that will really shape physiotherapy into the future operate like a duck on the water, serene and composed on the surface, but kicking frantically underneath. We need to be able to see beneath the surface of the changes now taking place and discover what is really driving change. Then we'll know better how to respond. So today I want to look at 5 contemporary issues that have the potential to really shape the future of physiotherapy education and practice. And if we start to look carefully at what's going on beneath the waterline, they may give us clues to the answers. First one, keeping the best of the old and bringing in the new. Excitingly, in recent years, physiotherapists have begun to explore practice models like the biopsychosocial model that challenge the body as machine. We've seen this especially in the management of complex physical and experiential problems like chronic pain in recent years. There are, however, some problems with the way this has been implemented, most notably how the social aspects of health are being represented. Because the model was developed as a collaboration between psychologists and doctors, most of the existing literature focuses on the body and mind, and the social is either ignored or described as a feature of the person's beliefs and feelings. You can see this in Salanthe's recent synthesis of the biopsychosocial model applied to the treatment of low back pain, for example. Here, factors with strong social significance like disability, quality of life and workability are all assessed as functions of the person's physical performance or emotional perceptions. Given the current lack of a truly sociological approach to these things, it would be perhaps more accurate to represent the biopsychosocial model more like this. The way that physios and others are currently using the model, the biomedical is still the dominant paradigm, governing health practice and thinking, but some aspects of psychology are being incorporated. The social, though, is almost entirely missing. This is significant because there is now considerable evidence that the social dimensions of health and illness are much greater predictors of people's long-term health than the biological or the psychological. And many studies have shown that the social determinants of health, poverty, poor standards of education, social inequality, poor access to services, and environmental degradation and other things are much stronger predictors of the burden of illness and more effective in guiding our interventions, as these quotes argue. So Helen Keller says one of the problems with contemporary healthcare is that it focuses on soft targets. Soft target risk factors such as physical activity, nutrition and weight control that target individuals rather than environments and structural conditions that in turn are causal pathways for things like heart disease, diabetes and cancer. And I think you can see how physiotherapists have taken very much that approach in recent years. And Mike Marmot, who is probably the father of the health promotion movement, and says, keep in mind that the utility of individual prevention strategies, so the one-to-one things we do with our patients, is actually quite weak. In other words, individual high-risk strategies of prevention are costly and not particularly effective. So raising our level of awareness of the sociological dimensions of health would be a powerful way to become more holistic in our approach and adapt to the changing world of healthcare in the 21st century. Second, the rise of positive health. In 2002, Rose Galvin wrote a paper titled "Disturbing Notions of Chronic Illness." In it, she asked, why are we surrounded with as much health advice as we are these days? It seems that there is expert advice on almost every aspect of your life now. from how to improve your microbiome and manage your stress levels, to how to get a flat stomach and treat migraine headaches. And she asked, why has this only really occurred in the last 2 decades? Galvin suggested that this was linked very closely to the changing economy of healthcare. She argued that since the 1970s, governments have been looking for ways to rein in the cost of the welfare state, and their answer has been to reduce taxes, make public healthcare function like a business, and open up the market to competition. As a result, the state has been able to gradually withdraw from its responsibility for people's health. Health education plays a key role here because, as Galvin argues, we need to make people feel responsible for their own health, so that if in a few years' time you go to your GP to see about maybe a hip replacement, the GP can say to you that, well, you were provided with all the information you needed to look after yourself 20 years ago. So if now you have a bad hip, you can't have followed our advice. Therefore, it must be your fault, and so you must pay. This is what Galvin calls culpability in the face of known risk, or the blame that we now attach to people because they should have known better. Galvin's point then is that health promotion is not really anything to do with making people healthier. It's about making people responsible for themselves so that the state can withdraw from care and reduce its costs. Physiotherapists have been eager to promote this approach, with recent calls to end passive treatments and promote positive health, for example. But these have less to do with evidence-based practice and much more to do with promoting a neoliberal agenda of self-care. Interestingly, though, this may be accelerating the separation of the profession from the state, one of its 2 historical masters, without anyone offering a financial or social model that can replace our grand bargain. So our enthusiasm for exercise-based therapy might make sense on one level, but it's also a worrying sign that the profession might be in the process of cutting itself adrift. Number 3, ageing as a bellwether of future physiotherapy. Bellwether is an American term that comes from looking at bellwether states. A bellwether state in America is one that predicts a future president. If physiotherapists were looking for a place to develop new ways of thinking and practicing, it would surely be in aged care. We are all well aware of the statistics predicting a future grey tsunami, but physiotherapists as a rule don't seem very interested in this area. Which is odd because many older people have complex comorbidities that require clinical experience and skill. They are also experts of their own well-being, and many are looking for ways to remain active, vital and involved as their bodies change and grow. So you would think physiotherapists should be the perfect people to work in this space. The problem is that physiotherapists still view ageing biomedically. Old age is seen as a process of inevitable decline, as a costly pathology, and as a problem to be managed. So our role has been to try and keep the person as independent as possible so that they are not a burden on their family, their friends and neighbours, and taxpayers generally. But this no longer reflects the reality of ageing. Older adults make rich contributions to their communities, and many over the age of 65 still have many years of productive life ahead of them. Older adults are also some of the biggest consumers of leisure and travel, fitness and well-being programs, and reconstructive surgery, and no longer feel that they have to be confined by stereotypical images of loss, depletion, and decay. I would remind you that Jane Fonda was 79 when this photograph was taken. In this paper I wrote 2 years ago, I argued that if physios can develop a new model of practice that works for older adults, we will not only open up a vast untapped market for physical therapy, but we'll also solve many of the problems now facing the rest of the physiotherapy profession. So aged care could be the forefront of the new physiotherapy renaissance. Number 4, disruptive technology. Unlike areas like manufacturing, financial services, journalism, healthcare has been relatively slow to experience digital disruption, a comment that Patricia made earlier when she said, I think practice is going very fast and education is going very slow. But all of this may be about to change, not necessarily because new technologies will do the work of caring better than humans, but because digital technologies are now changing the rules of the game. Consider, for example, the way that these 4 ubiquitous disruptive technologies now work. Music streaming services like iTunes and Spotify have changed the way we listen to music. You no longer have to buy a whole album to listen to the one song you like. But whole generations now expect to have choice over not only music, but everything. So what seems a simple, handy app on the surface is changing how people want to experience education and health, for instance, into the future. Google Maps is similar. No one is ever lost anymore, which takes so much stress away from finding a new place. But research is now showing that a whole generation of young people are experiencing anxiety because they are unprepared for uncertainty and feeling lost. We don't know yet what this will mean when they are confronted in a clinical situation for which they don't have an answer, or a patient who presents in an unusual way. YouTube and other streaming services are making experts of all of us, and social networking tools like Facebook and Twitter are showing that truth is no match for popularity. These digital tools are a good example of the idea of the duck on the water, because on the surface they appear to be tools that simply allow you to stream music, find your way around town, or chat with your friends. But underneath, their capacity for near infinite storage and quantum processing power is reshaping how we think about choice, security, expertise and truth, and so clearly these things must have an impact on how we and others think about physiotherapy into the future. And finally, the 5th example is what I've called post-professional healthcare. Perhaps the greatest challenge now faced by professions like physiotherapy is the belief that the professions as a whole are in decline. Authors like Daniel and Richard Susskind have argued that health professionals have become too expensive, their work is antiquated, and their expertise is only available to a few. Faced with increasing competition from chiropractors, osteopaths, exercise physiologists and others, it's been interesting to observe how physiotherapy leaders around the world have responded. Many have argued that physiotherapy should be a master's or even a doctoral entry program. Others have pushed for more specialization and the creation of new elite professional titles like physiotherapy consultant. The logic here is seductive. If physiotherapists can claim more recognition as specialists, then they can command higher incomes and more social capital. But this logic feeds directly into what Daniel and Richard Susskind are saying about what's wrong with health professionals today. The more specialised physiotherapy training becomes, the more physiotherapists will demand higher pay. Without the same government support that the profession once enjoyed, the increased costs will be passed on to the consumer. This will mean that in Suskind's quotes, the expertise of the best will be enjoyed only by the few, as physiotherapy becomes a service available only to what Barsky called the worried well, or those who can afford us. We will cease to be a profession for the whole population, and the 80% of the people who have the worst health, those with complex comorbidities, that are the greatest priority of governments today, will have to go elsewhere. Because of the cost, physiotherapists will be left to focus on the kinds of short-term curative treatments that don't actually need a lengthy doctoral training in the first place. And governments will withdraw their support for us because we are no longer able to respond to their health priorities. So while on the surface specialisation seems an appealing image for the future of the profession, we may actually be creating the conditions for our own demise. So what should we do about these challenges if we seriously want to continue to serve the population into the future? Well, in all of these cases, the issue is to change our way of thinking. If we begin by looking at everything we currently do as a symptom of the old way of doing things, then we're making our first step into a positive new future. So difficult though it might be, we need to give close critical attention to what we are saying about physiotherapy when we talk about anatomy and physiology as core subjects and don't put people first, when we fetishize normal movement and function and stigmatize those who don't measure up, when we teach students to regard people with detached objectivity, actively discouraging empathy and reciprocity, when we ignore the cultural, environmental, economic, political, philosophical, spiritual and social explanations that people hold for how and why they are ill and injured, and when we privilege evidence-based practice and quantitative measurement, perpetuating the myth that these will one day show the world how good we know physiotherapy to be. These are the monuments we have erected to the old world, the signs of a system that used to work well for us, but is showing increasing signs of decay. We have to realise that the old world is not slowly ebbing away from us, it is racing away like a fast-flowing river. The point to remember, though, is that it's still a river, and a river is a fabulous way to travel. The worst thing we can do, though, is to stand on the bank and watch it flow by. So let's consider next steps. Now, I know that some of this may be difficult to hear and it sounds as if the future is bleak, but in truth I'm suggesting the exact opposite. A sign of a real profession is one that can look critically at itself, identify its problems and come up with realistic and achievable solutions. It's no different than what we ask our patients to do. And if what they have been doing in the past is now causing them problems, we would advise them to change. One of the most important challenges ahead of us will be how to retain the best of the past while shaping the profession for the future. This is going to involve us taking a very different approach to creativity and innovation in the profession. Perhaps you can't see how things might change, or maybe you find it too scary to contemplate. But the challenge is what we do with those who can. What we do with those physios who are prepared to push at boundaries or even go beyond them will determine, to some extent, how successfully we navigate the changes now being demanded of us. So we have to think about how we are going to handle the disruption. At present, we have some very rigid rules about what physiotherapy is and isn't. Challenging these conventions is likely to result in a sanction from the registration authority or even being struck off. But how will we create the physiotherapy renaissance we need if anything that looks even slightly unusual is strangled at birth? We celebrate those people in society who overcome barriers, like this girl climbing the Berlin Wall. So how do we encourage this kind of pioneering spirit in today's therapists? We need a generation of creators, innovators, designers, disruptors, radicals, and counterintuitive thinkers in the profession if we are not going to be sidelined by others who are much more enterprising and much less fearful of change. And we know that there is no shortage of other professions without the same historical baggage as physiotherapy, eager and ready to take over this space if we don't claim it. We have to become comfortable challenging convention, saying the unsayable, thinking the unthinkable, in order that generations of physiotherapists that follow see our work today as the new normal. This is why we set up the Critical Physio Network, which we thought would be a small group of critical thinkers, but now has more than 650 members in more than 40 countries around the world. But it's physiotherapy educators and students that really have all the power here. And it's the work that we do that will perhaps have the most telling impact on reshaping physiotherapy into the future. And the reasons why educators matter so much here is because we're the only professional body in physiotherapy with a mandate to look into the future. Our registration bodies are focused on making sure that people work to establish standards and they police our professional boundaries and make sure that the profession's heritage is secure. Our professional societies are future focused, but their main interest is in the present, in promoting physiotherapy interests today. But it's educators that have to look to the future, to think about what people will need from physiotherapists in the next 10, 20 or 30 years, and to begin to make their preparations now. So the responsibility for creating innovators and disruptors lies primarily with us. We have to create the conditions for people to be more innovative in curricula and less rule-bound, more creative in their approach to patient care, with less standardized textbook approaches to assessment and treatment, more focused on people and less on techniques, more concerned with the cultural, economic, philosophical, sociological and spiritual dimensions of health, and less focused on more clinical trials and the latest methods of hamstring stretching. What we need is a renaissance. Here's an example of one way we can start to plan for the future. Some authors have argued that in the near future, technologies and new labour practices will significantly eat into the work of the professions, like physiotherapy, that we once monopolised. This is based on the belief that in the future, anything that is mundane or repetitive, that you can explain or list, standardise or quantify, will be given to those who are cheaper to train and employ than we are. It could be a machine like a robot, or a person who can do this kind of work at low cost. But these tasks will be the first to go. Now, this could have profound effects on physiotherapy because our traditional approach to practice has been based on handling skills and techniques that can be taught and reproduced quite mechanistically. Think here of massage and manipulation. Or involves relatively standardised advice and support. Think about exercise. Imagine what would happen if all the things you can explain and write up as a list of instructions were taken away and given to someone else. So hypothetically speaking, if this blue square represents physiotherapy as it is today, then the coloured boxes are just some of the areas that are already being suggested for widespread decomposition by health funders and planners. Things like complex information processing, like diagnosis and evidence-based decision-making, are ripe for artificial intelligence, as IBM's Watson computer is now showing. Heavy or repetitive manual work is likely to be taken up by a fleet of cheap service or care robots, and standardised advice from managing common conditions with basic exercises or home-based care may well all go online in the near future, with cheap physiotherapy advisors on hand instantaneously throughout the world, available 24 hours a day to provide the support. So the effect of losing these would be to reshape physiotherapy's professional boundaries. We're likely to lose some things that we've done for more than 100 years. The profession will inevitably look smaller and perhaps more ragged. Its boundaries will be much less clear, and for a time it will be harder to distinguish our work from others. But this will also bring an amazing opportunity to think about what actually lies at the heart of the profession when we take away all of the repetitive technical skills and routine decision-making that can be done just as well by other people. And once we understand what 21st century physiotherapy is really about, then we will be able to build from here and shape the profession to be a vital force for good for another century or more. After all, who is better placed to meet the needs of the changing economy of healthcare than a physiotherapist? If we ask ourselves which professions are best placed to meet the needs of future healthcare, we might think about the doctors. Doctors are very powerful and have many skills, but they don't have a hands-on practice and an intimate relationship with their patients. Could it be the nurses then? Well, nurses are certainly widely dispersed and have immense social respectability, but they're not diagnosticians. Midwives, dentists, podiatrists, osteopaths all have status, but their work focuses on single body systems. And the psi disciplines like psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry have become increasingly important in recent years, but they can't touch people and no experience of bodies. Complementary therapists are popular, but they're not respected as part of the orthodox health system and can only operate in the private sector. Exercise and sports scientists have moved into healthcare in recent decades, but they don't have our experience of comorbidities. No, it is only really physiotherapists that have all the skills necessary to respond to healthcare in the 21st century. So we have a duty to make use of more than a century of healthcare practice to ensure that future generations of patients receive the best possible quality care. So here are 10 suggestions for how things might be done differently. Number one, I'm sorry for the small font here. For every euro we spend on another clinical trial, we need to spend 2 on understanding the past, present and future of the profession. We need to look at the body as machine in every corner of the profession, and it will be hiding because it's very sneaky. We need to trap it and kill it. We need to be more critical about trends. If a modality becomes popular, ask, why this, why now? There's a hint here, it will be nothing to do with evidence-based practice. We need to focus on the missing element of the biopsychosocial model. Start thinking about the social significance of physiotherapy. We need to practice thinking against ourselves. If a way of thinking or practicing feels comfortable or right, it's probably feeding the old system that is causing the problems. We need to think what is at the core of the profession. It won't be what it used to be. We need to think about how to give up our power and become minoritarian, as Deleuze called it. And you may be surprised by the outcome of doing this. And we need to find ways to collaborate with people who make a living from being creative. Designers, artists, chefs, musicians. We should study the humanities, philosophy and sociology. They've been down here before and they know the way out. And finally, the sins of omission are far worse than the sins of commission. You should just do it. And so to close, my message is that we should know by now that we have to adapt. That to change, we need to know ourselves better, that we will need to learn some new skills to do this, and this starts with us, the educators. The End of Physiotherapy was written to help us understand more about ourselves, so I hope you find it useful, and I hope you find it helps in your conversations with your colleagues and students. But the End of Physiotherapy is only the first in a series of 3 books looking to diagnose physiotherapy. The second book in the series, titled Physiotherapy Otherwise, and I'm very proud of that title, will analyse physiotherapy sociologically and cover a lot of the themes I've talked about today. That will be out next year, and I've already begun work on the third book, which will be due in 2022. I mentioned the Critical Physiotherapy Network earlier. Many of you will know of it already, but for those of you who don't, if the ideas I've talked about today are of interest, I strongly urge you to have a look at some of the work that the people in the network are doing. These people are some of the most creative and innovative minds we have in the profession, and some of their work is at the forefront of thinking about where physiotherapy might go and what it might do in the future. And of course, if at any point you want to get in touch and talk more about your own ideas, I always love hearing from physiotherapists who are pushing boundaries and being disruptive. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I look forward to hearing how my educational colleagues in Europe are shaking up physiotherapy and designing templates for us all to follow into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your very inspiring keynote. There is some room for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So other people who have a very urgent question to ask to Dave. No critical question? Yeah. Not over there.
Oh my goodness.
So can you hear me now? Oh, this is so cool. Thank you for such an inspiring talk. I'm from Denmark. This is not new. Do you experience resistance? Do people say, that's such a stupid idea, or what do you experience?
I think people are very polite when they talk to me. I would say for every person who says, yeah, but what about this? I would say there are 9 people who say, yes, this absolutely resonates with what they think. But then they could be the people who, are nice and compliment me. So I might not hear some of the conversations in other departments. I think the point, though, that I'm trying to make, and a lot of the work that I do, is trying to write things and say things that are maybe, for some people, way out. Because, and this is a principle with the Critical Physio Network as well, if we can say things and write things that are way out here, then it creates space behind for people, maybe with more modest aspirations or more difficult, complex local situations, to at least feel like they've got some support. So it will annoy some people. It has aggravated a lot of people. I mean, the title itself, I was saying on Tuesday night in Nijmegen, my head of department, to this day, calls the book The Death of Physiotherapy. He won't use The End of Physiotherapy as the title. it's meant to be provocative. So I'm sure that, but people are very polite, very nice.
Okay, I think here is another question.
That's why it's soft.
Okay, so just, all right. Hello, thank you very much. My name is Solveig and I come from Iceland. This was brilliant.
Thank you.
And to be critical, there's a nice slide with a rubric where physiotherapy came out kind of nicely. It was kind of interest for me from where I come, not to see people, my fellow healthcare workers, such as social workers and occupational therapists in there, with all the focus on, yeah. I was just, I was waiting for them.
You're waiting for them to be
in the grid there, because they are, with all the focus on the importance of the social aspect of health. I was missing to see some of our more social colleagues in that grid.
My wife's an occupational therapist,
so maybe a question: why were they not in there?
I don't know whether there's some psychology going on there.
Why the dentist, but not the social worker or occupational therapist?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The last question is for Emma.
Thank you. Dave, thanks a million. That was a fabulous lecture.
Thank you.
I started in a new job last year and I brought some books with me. And I just put them on the table in my office without sort of thinking too much about it. And someone came in and said, "Oh, the End of Physiotherapy, and you started a new program." So it was there on the desk, and I was thinking I probably took it away. But my question to you is more from the perspective of World PT. Yeah. And this is not a criticism, it's a genuine question. Do you think the disruption in education is going to be more likely to happen in perhaps the perspectives that we don't immediately see in this room or perhaps in the book, which is in the low and low middle income countries? Is that where the capacity for disruption is greater? Or have you thought about as you say in your book, right, the particularly, the sort of, the very particularities of the history that has been written. So I'm curious to understand the extent to which this, you think, might apply to just high-income countries, or the extent to which there's greater agility and perhaps more scope for innovation and disruption in low and low middle income communities.
I don't know. I think it's very difficult to answer as to whether there's more capacity, because in some low to middle income countries, their relationship with the healthcare system is somewhat different. Many of them are not first contact providers. They don't have a strong relationship with the medical profession, and that's their primary goal. I think we have a duty of privilege as first world economies to actually be doing some of the work here, and I think to some extent that's difficult for us because we have historical precedent, we have a long history that we are having to, in a sense, move from without feeling like we're betraying. Adapt to, but without feeling like we're just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. For countries where their physiotherapy professions are newer, maybe that's less of a pressure. But I think their political clout is less as well. So I think there's something that we can do as more privileged first world countries to support that. So I don't know necessarily whether it's easier or harder for anybody. It'll be hard for everybody. I think their contexts will be different.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, David.